Figuring out where you are going for lunch or dinner, even breakfast, can be one of the most difficult decisions in a day. I know, it sounds really absurd, but it's the truth. I mean, sometimes we really struggle with decisions as silly as that. Start a conversation with whoever it is. It could be your friends, it could be your your kids, it could be your spouse, and you're just like, where do you want to eat? I don't know, where do you want to eat? I don't know, where do you want to eat? And there's no clear wrong decision, okay? There's no clear wrong decision. I mean, if you were to eat at, whatever restaurant it is, it's not like it's going to be a bad choice. I mean, you may not necessarily like the menu options. I mean, being now that I have celiac disease, there's decisions that I've got to make based on my diet, the things that I can and cannot eat. But there's no clear distinction as to what's wrong in that choice. I remember 10 years ago when I came to the conclusion that I was going to be pastoring at this church, there was this lead up to this moment where I decided that I was going to interview here, and the church had to make a lot of decisions as to whether or not they were interested enough in me as a candidate to fly my entire family here. We were in Ohio, and it was going to cost them a lot of money to get 5 of us at the time all the way out here just to preach in the church and then be voted in as the pastor of this church. And there were this moment in our lives, we were looking at several different ministry options, several different churches, and just seeking God's will. And there was a church from the Midwest, there was a church from farther south that were interested in us, and they even offered opportunities for us to come. And there was just these challenging places that we had come to in trying to make this choice. And it was clear that there was no specific direction. I mean, okay, I know that God, without a doubt, that God called me to Lancaster, New Hampshire. I have no doubts about my calling to Coos County. No doubts whatsoever. But at the time, and I know God in His will, I know God in His love, that if we were to have chosen a church in the Midwest or farther south, God wouldn't have looked at us and said, oh, well, you made the wrong turn, so I'm taking my hand of blessing off of your life and everything's going to fall apart. I have no doubt that we would have experienced success there as well. We would have experienced God's motion, God's movement, God's wonder in those places. We come to these forks in the road where we're confused, where we're doubting and insecure about the direction that He wants us to go. Ephesians 2:10 tells us that we are God's workmanship, created anew in Christ Jesus to do the good works that He has prepared for us in advance. That means that there is a will, there's a plan, there's a purpose that God has ordained for our lives. That God has ordained for our lives. There are certain unquestionable things that I know God has called us to, that God has called you to, that God has called me to. Unquestionable realities about who I'm supposed to be. Unquestionable reality about being a pastor. Unquestionable reality about fighting as hard as I can with the Lord's strength, becoming even more empowered to be the best husband. Empowered by God to be the best father. The best employee at Easter Seals. I mean, God has called me to do things. God has called me to ministry. God has called me to this work. And I have no doubts about that. But there are different things in our life, different crossroads, if you will, different moments where there is a literal 2 different directions, 3 different directions, 4 different directions, and we're concerned about a job. Some of us, we're still in those dating relationships, and we've got to make choices about that. What if I choose the wrong person to marry? Now, I know that in my heart of hearts, God spoke specifically to me about who my wife is going to be. But some of us, we're in that process, and we're afraid that if we marry the wrong person, everything's going to cave and fall apart. God doesn't work like that. The person you marry, God is going to do wonderful things, and that's not an excuse to make a bad decision. I mean, I'm like, oh, well, he's a fix-it-up project, or she'll get better, she won't be so diva-like at some point. No, I'm not telling you to take on projects. I'm just telling you that God works in whatever place that we find ourselves in. We've got to be confident and trustworthy of His work, of His actions, of His direction. Trust in the areas that we know are direct and clear and true about His will. Trust God in the things that we know without a doubt, and trust God in the direction that we got to take sometimes where we begin to move slowly and gradually. God's going to work in all